Country music history remembers them as the great gatekeepers, but in reality, they were trappers, the Wilburn Brothers. On the surface, they were Southern gentlemen with sunny smiles. On the inside, they were power-hungry wolves. Teddy scanned the room for leverage. Doyle drank himself into hiding. Together they turned Nashville into a chessboard, where they were the players and young artists were the pawns. They built the most beautiful, most luxurious cage and lured the legendary nightingale Loretta Lynn into it. This is the story of how the Wilburn brothers used fame as bait to stage a public kidnapping in broad daylight. The setting for this conflict began in Nashville, Tennessee, during the late 1950s. Forget the neon-soaked bachelorette party destination of today. Forget the corporate skyscrapers of Music Row. The Nashville of this era was a grittier, desperate place. It was an overgrown town trying to be a city, a place where the dust of the cotton fields still coated the boots of the men making million-dollar deals. The music industry was clustered around 16th and 17th Avenue South, a neighborhood of old Victorian houses converted into makeshift offices. The air smelled of stale tobacco smoke, cheap coffee, and desperation. It was a closed ecosystem, a village where everyone knew everyone's sins. Deals weren't made in boardrooms with lawyers present. They were made in the alleyways behind the Ryman Auditorium during a cigarette break, or over a plate of eggs at a greasy diner at 3 a.m. It was a world built on the handshake deal, a romantic Southern notion that sounded honorable but was, in reality, a weapon. A handshake leaves no paper trail. A handshake relies on the power dynamic between the two hands. And in Nashville, one hand was almost always holding the gold, while the other was holding a hat, begging for a chance. The men who ran this town, the publishers, the booking agents, the label executives, viewed themselves as patriarchs. They called the artists boys and girls, regardless of their age. They cultivated a myth of family. "We're all one big family here," they would say to a terrified kid fresh off a Greyhound bus. "We'll take care of you." It was a paternalistic lie designed to mask a predatory reality. They saw artists not as partners, but as children, talented, emotional, and utterly incapable of managing their own lives. These children needed fathers to hold their money, to tell them what to wear, to tell them what to sing, and, crucially, to tell them when to speak. The artists arriving in Nashville in those years were the perfect victims for this system. They were refugees from the crushing poverty of the American rural South. They were sharecroppers' sons and coal miners' daughters. They had grown up in shacks with dirt floors, wearing flour sack dresses and eating beans 3 times a day. They carried a deep genetic trauma of scarcity. When you have known true hunger, when you have seen your parents break their backs for pennies, a man in a suit offering you $50 a week just to sing feels like an angel sent from God. You don't read the contract. You don't ask about royalties. You don't ask about publishing rights. You sign the paper before the angel changes his mind. You sign it out of gratitude. You sign it out of fear. And the men in the suits counted on that fear. It was the currency that bought them lifetimes of servitude. And nobody, absolutely nobody, played this game with more cold-blooded precision than Teddy and Doyle Wilburn. Born in Hardy, Arkansas, Teddy in 1931, Doyle in 1930, they were children of the Depression. They didn't just learn the music business, they were conscripted into it. Teddy and Doyle Wilburn began their careers as young boys, performing as part of the Wilburn family on street corners and in school gymnasiums across the South. They learned early that if they didn't sing, the family didn't eat. They learned that a smile, a wink, a bit of charm could mean the difference between a warm bed and sleeping in the car. They were hardened veterans of the road before they hit puberty. This childhood stripped them of any romantic illusions about art. Music wasn't a hobby. It was a trade. It was a hustle. It was survival. By the time they arrived in Nashville as young men, they had already lived a lifetime. They had served in the military during the Korean War, a hiatus that only sharpened their ambition. When they returned, they were a polished, lethal unit. They were handsome in that distinct mid-century way, clean-cut, jawlines sharp enough to cut glass, hair pomaded into submission. Teddy, the elder by a year, was the brain. Quiet, meticulous, obsessive. He was the one who studied the charts, who understood the intricate, almost mathematical structure of a hit song. He was the one who listened to a demo tape and heard not just the melody, but the money. He was the architect. Doyle was the face. Loud, boisterous, brimming with a dangerous electric charisma. He was the salesman, the one who could charm a promoter out of his last dollar, the one who could slap a DJ on the back and make him feel like the most important man in the world. But beneath Doyle's gregarious surface lay a volatility, a darkness that was beginning to curdle into something ugly. He had a temper that could flare like a match in a gas station. He liked the drink, and the drink liked him a little too much. Together they were unstoppable. By the late 1950s, they were stars. They had hits like Somebody's Back in Town and Which One Is to Blame. They were members of the Grand Ole Opry. They were royalty. But the Wilburns were smarter than the average singer. They looked around at the older stars, the ones who had been famous in the 40s and were now broke, playing county fairs for peanuts. They saw the pattern, the fame fades, the voice cracks, the fans move on. They realized the terrifying truth of the music business. The singer is disposable. The song is eternal. And the contract is God. So while other stars were buying Cadillacs and drinking away their royalties, Teddy and Doyle were building a fortress. They didn't just want to play the game. They wanted to own the casino. They founded the Surefire Music Company. This was their publishing arm. In the music business, publishing is where the real wealth is buried. If you own the publishing, you get paid every time the song is played, recorded, or used forever. It is the ultimate passive income. Then they founded the Wilhelm Agency. This was their management and booking arm. If Surefire owned the songs, Wilhelm owned the singers. They created a closed loop, a vertically integrated empire where they could sign a young artist, make them record songs owned by Surefire, book them on tours through Wilhelm, and take a percentage at every single step of the process. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was a machine designed to extract maximum value from human talent. By 1960, the fortress was complete. They had the money. They had the connections. They had the respect of the industry. But they were missing one thing. They needed a vehicle. They needed a project. They needed a star who could transcend the genre, someone whose light was so bright it would illuminate their entire empire. They had a roster of decent singers, solid journeymen, but they didn't have a supernova. They were looking for clay. They wanted raw material, someone talented but unformed, someone desperate enough to work hard and naive enough to be grateful. They wanted someone they could mold from the ground up, someone who would owe them everything. And then a demo tape arrived. Or perhaps it was a grainy photograph, or a whisper from a contact in Washington State. The details are hazy, lost in the mythology of Nashville. But the subject was clear. There was a girl, a housewife, a mother of 4, barely in her 20s. She lived in Custer, Washington, but she sounded like the deep, dark hills of Kentucky. She had no money, she had no clothes. She had a husband who was as wild as a Mustang. Her name was Loretta. The Wilburns didn't hear a star when they first heard her. They heard something better. They heard vulnerability. They heard a voice that cracked with the kind of authentic pain you can't teach in school. They heard a woman who had walked through fire and was still standing. Doyle, with his salesman's instinct, smelled blood in the water. He saw the angle. The coal miner's daughter. It was a marketing hook sent from heaven. Teddy, the architect, heard the raw potential in her songwriting, clunky, unpolished, but shimmering with a lyrical honesty that cut to the bone. They looked at each other, the brothers who had sung for nickels in the freezing cold. They smiled that practiced, professional smile. They knew. They prepared the contract. They drafted the clauses about exclusive representation. They typed out the words perpetuity and irrevocable. They set the trap. They didn't see a person coming toward them. They saw an asset. They saw their legacy. Loretta Lynn was traveling north toward Nashville. She believed she was heading toward freedom. She had no idea she was walking straight into a gilded cage disguised as a rescue mission. The bird landed in Nashville, but she didn't look like a bird of paradise. She looked like a rough-hewn sparrow, battered by the winds of poverty and exhausted from a life that had already lasted 100 years, even though she was barely 20-something. When Loretta Lynn stepped off the bus and onto the pavement of Music City in 1960, she was a walking contradiction. She was terrified, yet possessed of a terrifyingly raw ambition. She was a mother of 4 children, a woman who had scrubbed floors and picked strawberries, yet in the shark tank of the music industry, she was an infant. She brought with her a few homemade dresses, a guitar that felt too big for her hands, and a husband, Oliver Doolittle Lynn, who was as volatile and unpredictable as a thunderstorm in the hollers. They were outsiders. In the polished, hierarchical village of Nashville, they were hillbillies. And in 1960, that word was not a badge of honor. It was a label that meant you were uneducated, unrefined, and ultimately exploitable. Loretta didn't know the rules. She didn't know that you were supposed to have an appointment. She didn't know that you were supposed to have a glossy 8x10 headshot and a professionally recorded demo. She just knew she had songs in her head, songs that hammered against her skull demanding to be let out. She and Dew had driven across the country, sleeping in their car on bologna sandwiches, fueled by a delusional kind of hope. They had mailed out their first scratchy record, I'm a Honky-Tonk Girl, to every radio station they could find, plotting their route by which DJs were willing to play it. It was a guerrilla campaign born of ignorance and desperation, and it caught the attention of the sharks. When the Wilburn brothers, Teddy and Doyle, first laid eyes on Loretta Lynn, the air in the room must have shifted. To the average observer, she was a mess. Her accent was thick as molasses, a dialect of the Kentucky mountains that sounded alien to the smoother, urbanizing south of Nashville. Her clothes were Sears Roebuck gingham, sewn by hand, the kind of outfits that screamed poverty in a town that worshipped rhinestones. She didn't know how to stand at a microphone. She didn't know how to talk to the press. She was shy, hiding behind her hair, deferring to her husband. But Teddy and Doyle were not average observers. They were master craftsmen. They were prospectors who had spent their lives sifting through mud looking for gold. Where others saw a backward country girl, the Wilburns saw a blank canvas. Teddy, the meticulous architect, saw the authenticity. He realized instantly that her hillbilly nature wasn't a liability. It was her greatest asset. The country music audience was changing, becoming more suburban, but they yearned for a connection to the dirt, to the home place, to the struggle. Loretta was the struggle made flesh. She wasn't pretending to be a coal miner's daughter. She had the coal dust in her spiritual DNA. Doyle, the hustler, saw the marketability. He saw a woman who could be molded, packaged, and sold. He saw the girls singer slot on their upcoming television show, a role that needed to be filled not by a diva who would demand equal billing, but by a grateful protege who would sing when told and smile when the camera light turned red. The courtship was brief and overwhelming. To Loretta, the Wilburn brothers were like royalty descending from a cloud. These were men she had heard on the radio, men whose faces were on album covers. That they would even speak to her was a miracle. That they wanted to help her was a divine intervention. She was starving, not just for food, but for validation. And here were two handsome, successful men telling her she was special. They invited her into their world. They bought her dinner, real dinner in a restaurant with cloth napkins. They listened to her songs. They laughed at her jokes, not with mockery, but with a kind of delighted surprise. They charmed her. They charmed Dew, which was an even harder task. They spun a web of Southern hospitality that felt like a warm embrace. Then came the paperwork. It is a scene that is played out 1,000 times in the history of music, but rarely with such devastating consequences. The setting was likely the offices of the Wilhelm Agency, a space that smelled of stale smoke and typewriter ribbon. The Wilburns presented the contracts. To Loretta, the documents were incomprehensible. They were thick stacks of paper filled with legal jargon, exclusive rights, power of attorney, perpetuity, recoupable expenses. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have an agent. She had Dew, who could fight a man with his fists but was outmatched by the ink-stained warfare of contracts. And she had her gratitude. The Wilburns explained it simply, framing it as a partnership. "We are going to take care of you, Loretta. We are going to handle everything. You just sing. We'll worry about the booking, the publishing, the recording, the clothes, the bus, the band." The show cemented the power dynamic in the public eye. The Wilburn brothers were the hosts, the bosses, the men in charge. Loretta was the guest, the subordinate, the discovery. It reinforced the idea that she existed within their orbit, that she was a satellite circling their planet. Behind the scenes, the dynamic was even more rigid. The Wilburns controlled her schedule with an iron fist. They booked her on the road relentlessly. The Wilburn Brothers tour was a grinding caravan that crisscrossed the country, playing state fairs, high school auditoriums, and smoky honky-tonks. Loretta was the opening act. She would go out, sing her heart out to warm up the crowd, and then retreat to the side of the stage while Teddy and Doyle took the spotlight. They traveled on the same bus, a claustrophobic tube of steel rolling through the endless American night. Life on the bus was a peculiar kind of hell. It was a distinct ecosystem with its own laws. Doyle, the fun brother, was the ringmaster of this traveling circus. In the early days, his drinking was seen as high spirits. He was the guy who bought the rounds, who told the dirty jokes, who kept the energy up. But as the miles rolled on, the high spirits began to curdle. Loretta, trying to raise her children, who were often dragged along or left with relatives, was living in a state of perpetual exhaustion. She was sleeping in a bunk that smelled of diesel fumes and other people's cologne. She was eating diner food at 2 a.m. She was performing with a migraine, with the flu, with cramps, because the Wilburns said the show must go on. "You don't cancel, Loretta," they would say. "If you cancel, the promoters won't book you again. You owe it to the fans. You owe it to us." That phrase, "you owe it to us," became the mantra of her existence. It was the invisible chain that bound her to them. Whenever she questioned a booking, whenever she complained about the exhaustion, whenever she asked why her paycheck seemed so small compared to the crowds she was drawing, they would remind her. "Remember where we found you, Loretta? Remember the gingham dress? Remember who put you on TV? Who got you the deal with Decca? We made you. Without us, you're back in Butcher Holler doing laundry." It was a powerful psychological weapon. Imposter syndrome is rampant among the poor who strike it rich. Loretta deep down feared they were right. She feared that her success was a fluke, a magic trick performed by the Wilburns, and that if she stepped out of their circle, the carriage would turn back into a pumpkin. So she kept singing. She kept smiling. She kept signing the extensions to the contracts. And the Wilburns kept building. With Loretta as their flagship artist, the Surefire music catalog grew in value every day. They were publishing her hits, songs like Success, Before I'm Over You, Wine, Women, and Song. These songs were climbing the charts, generating mechanical royalties, performance royalties, sheet music sales. The money was pouring into the Wilburn empire, but Loretta saw a fraction of it. The agency took their 15 to 20% off the top of her gross earnings. Then they deducted the recoupable expenses, the bus, the band, the clothes, the studio time. Then Surefire took the publisher's share of the songwriting royalties. It was a complex shell game. The money moved from one Wilburn pocket to another Wilburn pocket, and Loretta was left waiting for the crumbs that fell from the table. She was generating a fortune, but she was living on an allowance. Yet amidst the exploitation, there was genuine artistic growth. This is the paradox that makes the story so difficult. Under Teddy's guidance, Loretta was getting better. She was becoming a master vocalist. She was learning how to control an audience. She was recording with Owen Bradley, the genius producer at Decca, creating a sound that would define a generation. The Wilburns were good at their jobs. They were excellent managers in the sense that they made her famous. They positioned her perfectly in the market. They fought for her to get airplay. They protected her from other sharks in the industry. They built a wall around her, a fortress of protection. But this protection came at the cost of her autonomy. By the mid-1960s, the dynamic began to shift in subtle ways. Loretta was no longer the scared girl from the holler. She was a woman in her late 20s, a seasoned professional who had played thousands of shows. She was starting to realize that the crowds were screaming louder for her than they were for the brothers. She was seeing her name climb higher on the marquee, and she was starting to see the cracks in the Wilburn Brothers themselves. Doyle's drinking was moving from social to pathological. The fun-loving uncle was disappearing, replaced by a man who was bloated, red-faced, and increasingly belligerent. There were nights on the bus where the tension was so thick you could choke on it. "We will make you a star. All you have to do is sign here." It sounded like relief. It sounded like a burden being lifted from her shoulders. She didn't see the shackles hidden in the fine print. She didn't understand that by signing with the Wilhelm Agency for management and the Surefire Music Company for publishing, she was effectively becoming their employee, their product, and their tenant. She was signing away the rights to her own voice and her own words for a term that could stretch on for decades. She was giving them the power to decide where she went, what she sang, and how much she got paid. She picked up the pen. Her hand might have trembled. She signed. In that moment, the rescue mission ended and the ownership began. The trap snapped shut, but the sound was muffled by the pop of a champagne cork. With the ink dry, the work began. This was the phase of the transformation, the grueling boot camp where the girl from Butcher Holler was dismantled and reassembled into Loretta Lynn the star. Teddy Wilburn took the lead. If this story is a tragedy, Teddy is the complicated, quiet villain who genuinely believed he was the hero. He became her Pygmalion. He took this wild, unkempt vine and began to prune it aggressively. He started with the songs. Loretta's songwriting was instinctive, pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. She wrote on paper bags, on napkins, on the backs of envelopes. Her lyrics were raw, conversational, and often structurally chaotic. She broke the rules of meter and rhyme because she didn't know the rules existed. Teddy would sit with her for hours in a small office or a hotel room, guitar in hand. He didn't rewrite her songs. He was smart enough to know that her voice was unique, but he edited them. He tightened the verses. He fixed the bridges. He taught her the structure of a commercial country hit: verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, out. He polished the rough diamonds until they sparkled. But he also controlled the content. He steered her towards songs that fit the image they were building, the feisty but heartbroken country girl. He encouraged the woman-scorned narratives because they sold records. He was shaping her artistic soul, filtering her raw experience through his commercial lens. Then came the physical transformation. The Wilburns knew that television was the future, and television was a visual medium. The homemade gingham dresses had to go. They took her shopping. They bought her gowns with sequins. They bought her heels. They sent her to hair salons to tease her dark hair into the towering bouffants that were the style of the day. They fixed her teeth. They taught her how to walk. Loretta, used to walking on dirt roads and uneven floorboards, had a stride that was purposeful and heavy. Teddy taught her to glide. He taught her how to hold her head up, how to smile into the lens, how to cheat her body toward the audience. He taught her stage patter, what to say between songs, how to introduce the band, how to be folksy without being backward. It was a grueling, humiliating, and exhilarating process. Loretta was being erased and rewritten. She was learning that her natural self was not enough. It had to be refined. She absorbed these lessons with a hunger born of survival. She wanted to be good. She wanted to please them. She wanted to be worthy of the investment they were making in her. Every expense, the dresses, the salon visits, the guitar strings, the travel, was put on the ledger. Recoupable. It was a word she would come to hate. It meant that while the Wilburns were paying for everything up front, it was effectively a loan with interest, a loan that she would have to pay back from her future earnings. She was digging a financial hole with every new pair of shoes, a hole she didn't even know she was standing in. The centerpiece of this new life was the Wilburn Brothers show. Premiering in 1963, the syndicated television show was the Wilburns' fiefdom. It was a half hour of carefully choreographed cornball humor, gospel songs, and country hits, filmed in color and broadcast to millions. It was the primary vehicle for their empire, and Loretta Lynn was cast as the girl singer. This role was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was priceless exposure. In an era before the internet, before 24-hour music channels, being on a weekly national TV show was the golden ticket. It made her face recognizable in households from Maine to California. It legitimized her. When promoters saw her on TV with the Wilburns, they booked her. On the other hand, the role was restrictive. On the show, she was the little sister. She was the cute sidekick. She was there to sing her one song, engage in some scripted banter where Teddy or Doyle would make a gentle joke at her expense, and then smile while they sang the gospel closer. She was a prop in their production. Nights where Doyle would scream at the driver, scream at the band, and turn his watery, angry eyes on Loretta. He started to resent her. It is a common pathology in the mentor-mentee relationship. The creator falls in love with the creation until the creation becomes greater than the creator. Then love turns to envy. Doyle Wilburn, the star, was watching Loretta Lynn, the project, eclipse him. He was the one who had made her, yet she was the one the photographers wanted to shoot. He began to undermine her, a snide comment before she went on stage, a criticism of her dress, a reminder of her lack of education. "You're nothing without us, Loretta, don't you forget it." Teddy, the quiet architect, watched it all. He was caught in the middle. He was the younger brother, dominated by Doyle's forceful personality. He tried to play the peacemaker. He would comfort Loretta after a Doyle outburst, playing the good cop to Doyle's bad cop. He doesn't mean it, Loretta. He's just tired. He's under a lot of pressure. You know he loves you. This dynamic, the abusive volatility of Doyle and the passive enabling of Teddy, created a confusing, toxic web. Loretta felt sorry for Teddy. She felt afraid of Doyle, and she felt bound to both of them. But the world outside the bus was changing. The 1960s were exploding. Women were burning bras. The civil rights movement was marching. And in country music, a new breed of artist was emerging. Artists who wrote their own rules. Loretta was writing songs that were becoming increasingly bold. Don't Come Home A-Drinkin' wasn't just a catchy title. It was a shot across the bow. It was a song about a woman standing up to a drunk, entitled man. When she sang it on stage, staring out into the lights, one has to wonder if she was singing it to Do, her husband, or if, in the back of her mind, she was singing it to the man standing in the wings, holding a tumbler of scotch, checking his watch, and counting her money. The clay had hardened. The statue was breathing. And the architects of the cage were about to discover that the bird they had captured had grown talons. The golden handcuffs were still locked tight, gleaming under the stage lights, but the wrists beneath them were getting stronger. And the key, the realization that she didn't need them anymore, was slowly, painfully beginning to form in Loretta Lynn's mind. The rescue was over. The hostage situation had begun. The year was 1968. America was burning. The cities were rioting. The Vietnam War was tearing the cultural fabric apart, and a sense of chaotic transformation hung heavy in the humid air. But inside the air-conditioned bubble of the Wilburn Brothers tour bus, the war was private, silent, and suffocating. The empire that Teddy and Doyle had built, a fortress constructed of handshake deals, publishing rights, and the golden voice of a coal miner's daughter, was beginning to groan under its own weight. The structural integrity was failing, not because of external pressure, but because of a rot that had taken hold at the very center of the foundation. By this point, the dynamic between Loretta Lynn and her mentors had shifted from a rescue mission to a hostage situation, though the ransom was being paid in installments of hits and humility. Loretta was no longer the frightened girl from Butcher Holler. She was the female vocalist of the year. She had proven she could stand toe-to-toe with the legends of the industry. Her voice had hardened. It had acquired the steel and grit that comes from thousands of hours of singing over bad sound systems in smoky halls. She knew who she was on stage. But off stage, she was still trapped in the psychological amber of gratitude and debt. The catalyst for the coming collapse was not Loretta, at least not initially. It was the disintegration of the brotherhood itself. The Wilburn brothers had always been a singular entity, Teddy and Doyle, spoken in one breath, like bread and butter or fame and fortune. They had survived the Great Depression, the freezing street corners of their childhood busking days, and the brutal trenches of the music industry by relying on a symbiotic bond. Teddy was the brain. Doyle was the heart. Teddy was the rudder. Doyle was the sail. But now the sail was tattered, flapping violently in a gale of 90-proof winds, and the rudder had snapped. By 1968, Doyle had become a severe liability. The charm was gone, replaced by a volatility that terrified promoters. In the gossip-fueled world of Nashville, word traveled fast. Booking the Wilburns was a gamble. You might get the showman, or you might get a belligerent drunk who would cancel 5 minutes before showtime. Loretta found herself in the humiliating position of being the diplomat for her own jailer. The tension on the tour bus was a physical thing, a heavy static charge that made the hair on your arms stand up. It was a rolling prison cell shared by the victim and the perpetrator, with the enabler driving the getaway car. Teddy sat in the front, watching the road, watching the ledger, and watching his brother disintegrate. This is the pivotal tragedy of 1968, the breaking of Teddy Wilburn. Teddy loved his brother. Their bond was forged in the fire of shared trauma, in the hunger of their youth. But Teddy was also a businessman. He was the architect of an empire that was worth millions, and he saw with the cold clarity of an accountant that Doyle was burning it down. To save the business, Teddy attempted to control Doyle's increasingly erratic behavior, which led to severe internal conflict and tension within the partnership. But Doyle was uncontrollable. When Teddy tried to intervene to suggest Doyle slow down, to suggest he step back from the frontman role, Doyle would explode. His insecurity, fueled by the alcohol and the gnawing realization that Loretta, the product, was now the star, turned into paranoia. He accused Teddy of siding with her. He accused Teddy of trying to push him out. The arguments between the brothers were legendary: screaming matches in hotel rooms, tense standoffs in the studio control booth, silences that stretched for hundreds of miles on the highway. Loretta was caught in the crossfire. She was the prize they were fighting over, and she was the wedge driving them apart. She saw Teddy's exhaustion. She saw the way his shoulders slumped when Doyle poured another drink. She felt a deep, confusing pity for Teddy. He was her protector, yes, but he was also powerless. The man who controlled her career couldn't even control his own blood. And then the unthinkable happened. The partnership cracked. Around 1968, the friction became unbearable. But unlike a marriage, this brotherhood had no divorce clause. Teddy Wilburn didn't walk away physically. He couldn't. The contracts and the show bound them together. Instead, he withdrew emotionally. He continued to perform, continued to smile on cue for the cameras, but the brotherhood was dead behind his eyes. He stopped trying to save Doyle and retreated into a shell of stoic professionalism. He could no longer watch his brother self-destruct, and he could no longer be the buffer between Doyle's chaos and the world. For Loretta, this was a catastrophe. Teddy had been the good cop. He had been the soft place to land. When Doyle was cruel, Teddy was kind. When Doyle was unreasonable, Teddy was logical. He was the only person in the Wilburn organization who treated her like an artist rather than an asset. His presence had made the unbearable bearable. He was the spoonful of sugar that helped the bitter medicine go down. With Teddy gone, or at least removed from the daily operations, the buffer was removed. Loretta was now alone in the cage with the monster. The dynamic shifted instantly and violently. Without Teddy's restraining influence, Doyle's behavior became even more erratic and domineering. He felt abandoned by his brother, and he directed that rage toward the only target left, Loretta. He tightened his grip. The control became pettier, more vindictive. He scrutinized her every move. He obsessed over her schedule. He isolated her even further from the rest of the industry, terrified that someone would whisper in her ear, someone would tell her the truth about her worth. It was during this period, the dark years of the late 60s, that the psychological abuse ramped up. Doyle would tell her she was getting old. He would tell her the hits were drying up. He would tell her that without him the industry would eat her alive. He preyed on her deepest insecurities, her lack of education, her rural background, her fear of poverty. He gaslit her into believing that she was lucky he was still willing to manage her. But while Doyle was playing mind games, he was failing at the basic job of management. The mismanagement that would later become the center of the legal battle began to manifest in undeniable ways. Opportunities were missed because Doyle was too hungover to return a call. Endorsement deals were lost because he was too arrogant to negotiate. He was booking her into venues that were beneath her status simply because he had old drinking buddies who owned them, or because he needed quick cash to cover gambling debts or bad investments. Loretta was working harder than ever, but she felt like she was running on a treadmill. The money, the vast rivers of cash generated by hits like Fist City, seemed to evaporate before it reached her bank account. She and Dew were living in the expansive, crumbling mansion in Hurricane Mills, a property that was supposed to be her sanctuary, but was becoming a financial albatross. The roof leaked, the bills piled up. She would come home from a grueling tour, exhausted to her bones, only to find that there was barely enough money to keep the lights on. This is where Oliver Doolittle Lynn steps out of the shadows. For years, history has painted Dew as the villain in his own right, the cheating, drinking husband who gave Loretta the heartache she turned into hits. And that is true. He was a hard man, a product of the same rough culture as Loretta. But in the narrative of the Wilburns, Dew plays a fascinating contradictory role. He became the unlikely hero. Dew was uneducated, but he possessed a feral, street-smart intelligence. He was a hustler. He knew the value of $1 because he had fought for every single one he'd ever made. He watched the Wilburns with a suspicion that bordered on hatred. He hated their suits. He hated their polished smiles. He hated the way they spoke down to him, treating him like the hillbilly husband who should just be grateful to carry the guitar cases. But mostly, he hated the math. Dew would sit at the kitchen table in Hurricane Mills late at night, staring at the meager royalty statements Loretta brought home. He would scribble figures on the back of an envelope. He would count the number of tickets sold at the show he had just attended. He would multiply, and the numbers didn't add up. "Retta," he would growl, slamming his hand on the table. "They are robbing us blind. Look at this. You sold out the Coliseum. Where is the money?" For a long time, Loretta defended them. It was a reflex, a conditioned response implanted by years of psychological grooming. "Dew, you don't understand the expenses. The bus costs money. The band costs money. Teddy says." "To hell with what Teddy says," Dew would shout. "Teddy isn't here. Doyle is a drunk, and we are broke. You are the queen of country music, and you are broke. Wake up, woman." Dew began to agitate. He began to push. He was the sand in the gears of the Wilburn machine. He started asking questions that Doyle couldn't answer. He started demanding to see the receipts. He started showing up at the agency office, standing in the lobby with his arms crossed, a menacing, silent presence that made the secretaries nervous. Doyle despised Dew. He saw him as an ignorant obstacle, a peasant daring to question the lord of the manor. The friction between the two men was volatile. There were threats. There were moments where violence seemed inevitable. Doyle tried to drive a wedge between Loretta and her husband, telling her that Dew was jealous of her success, that Dew was holding her back, that she should leave him. It was a dangerous game. By trying to force Loretta to choose between her managers and her husband, Doyle inadvertently pushed her toward the one person who actually had a vested interest in her financial freedom. Dew might have been a bad husband in many ways, but he was her bad husband. And unlike the Wilburns, he wasn't taking 50% off the top. The turning point was slow, painful, and messy. It wasn't a single moment of clarity, but a gradual erosion of trust. It was the accumulation of small indignities. It was the time Doyle forgot to book a hotel room and Loretta had to sleep in the bus station. It was the time a check bounced. It was the time she heard a song on the radio, a song she had written, and the DJ announced it was published by the Wilburn Brothers, and she realized she didn't even own the copyright to the story of her own life. The breaking of the emotional bond was harder than the financial one. Loretta Lynn, is a woman of deep, abiding loyalty. In the mountain code, loyalty is the highest virtue. You dance with the one who brought you. To leave the Wilburns felt like a sin. It felt like ingratitude. It felt like betraying her own history. But the reality of her situation was becoming impossible to ignore. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. She was standing on stage receiving standing ovations, accepting awards, being hailed as an icon, yet she had to ask Doyle Wilburn for permission to buy a new refrigerator. She was the voice of the working woman, yet she had no control over her own work. Sometime around 1970, Teddy attempted to return to the fold, perhaps trying to salvage the sinking ship. But it was too little, too late. The toxicity was too ingrained to be fixed by his presence alone. Seeing no other option, it was Dew who finally dragged Loretta to a lawyer. Not a Nashville lawyer, not one of the good old boys who played golf with Teddy and Doyle, but an outsider, someone who didn't care about the Grand Ole Opry hierarchy. When Loretta Lynn finally met with a lawyer, the contracts she had signed were analyzed. Her legal counsel confirmed the agreement was highly restrictive and detrimental to her career. Dew pacing the room like a caged tiger. The lawyer reading the contract she had signed nearly a decade ago with stars in her eyes. The lawyer looks up. He takes off his glasses. He looks at Loretta with a mixture of pity and professional outrage. "Mrs. Lynn," he says, his voice quiet, "this isn't a management contract. This is an indentured servitude agreement. You don't own anything. They own the publishing, they own the booking, they own the agency. They effectively own you." He explains the terms. He explains the rollover clauses that meant the contract essentially never ended. He explains that the expenses they were deducting were likely inflated. He explains that for the last 10 years, she has been building a castle for two men who are currently letting it crumble around her ears. Loretta listens. She thinks about the gingham dress. She thinks about the first time Teddy took her shopping. She thinks about the bus rides. She thinks about Doyle screaming at her. She thinks about her kids growing up while she was on the road earning money she never saw. She thinks about the debt she thought she owed them. And she realizes with a cold, hard shock that the debt was paid a long time ago. She doesn't owe them. They owe her. They owe her a decade of her life. The tears stop. The handkerchief is put away. She looks at Dew. She looks at the lawyer. "What do I do?" she asks. "You have to fire them," the lawyer says. "And then you have to prepare for war, because they won't let you go. To them, you aren't a person. You're an annuity, and nobody gives up a winning lottery ticket without a fight." It was the moment the coal miner's daughter truly grew up. She realized that to save herself, she had to destroy the myth of the Wilburn family. She had to become the thing they feared most, an ungrateful woman. She had to take the knife out of her back and use it to cut the ropes. She went home to Hurricane Mills. She probably didn't sleep that night. She probably sat on her porch listening to the crickets, knowing that the next day she would drop a bomb on Music Row that would shatter the windows of 16th Avenue. She drafted the letter, or rather the lawyer did. It was dry, legal, and devoid of emotion. It stated that due to breach of contract, gross mismanagement, and failure to perform duties, Loretta Lynn was terminating her relationship with the Wilhelm Agency effective immediately. She mailed it. The case, Wilhelm Agency versus Loretta Lynn, was the nuclear option. It was a legal scorched earth campaign designed to do two things: force her back into submission through sheer financial terror, or destroy her so thoroughly that no other manager would ever touch her. They sued for breach of contract. They sued for future earnings. They sued for the right to represent her in perpetuity. They claimed that she owed them hundreds of thousands of dollars in commissions. They painted a picture of a thankless, greedy diva who had used their resources to climb to the top and was now kicking away the ladder. For Loretta, the lawsuit was a terrifying reality check. She was the queen of country music, yes, but in 1970, queens could still be beheaded by the men who built the throne. She was facing a legal machine that had decades of experience and deep pockets. She had her husband Do, a man who would fight a circle saw with his bare hands but was out of his depth in a chancery court. And she had a lawyer who was willing to bet his career on a long shot. The preparation for the trial was a grueling archaeological dig into the ruins of the relationship. To win, Loretta couldn't just say she wanted to leave. The contract she had signed was, on its face, valid. It was draconian, unfair, and exploitative, but in the eyes of the law, a bad deal is still a deal. If you sign away your life for magic beans, you are legally obligated to hand over the life when the beans grow. Her only defense, her only hope, was to prove that the Wilburns had broken the contract first. She had to prove breach of fiduciary duty. She had to prove that they were incompetent, negligent, and damaging to her career. This meant she had to take the private nightmare of the tour bus and put it into the public record. She had to weaponize the secrets she had kept to protect them. She had to tell the world about Doyle. The discovery phase of the trial was a bloodletting. Loretta's legal team began to depose witnesses, subpoena records, and reconstruct the timeline of the Wilhelm Agency's decline. They had to gather evidence of every missed phone call, every botched booking, every drunken outburst. They had to find promoters who were willing to testify that they stopped booking Loretta Lynn, not because they didn't want her, but because they couldn't stand dealing with Doyle Wilburn. This was no small feat. Nashville was a small town. Promoters were afraid of the Wilburns. The brothers still controlled a powerful publishing company. They still had a TV show. They still had friends in high places. Testifying against them was risky. It meant taking a side in a civil war, but the rot was too visible to hide. The stories began to trickle in, then flood. There were affidavits describing Doyle Wilburn showing up to venues so intoxicated he couldn't stand. Stories of him screaming at sound engineers, insulting festival organizers, and effectively holding Loretta's career hostage to his own ego. The mismanagement wasn't abstract. It was a chronicle of wasted potential. Loretta was working harder than anyone in the business, yet her income was stagnant because her representation was paralyzed by alcoholism and arrogance. The trial itself, held in the Davidson County Chancery Court, was the ugliest spectacle Nashville had seen in years. It was a collision of the old guard and the new reality. On one side sat the Wilburn brothers, Teddy looking pale, thin, and fiercely dignified, trying to maintain the illusion of the benevolent mentor, and Doyle looking bloated, angry, and defiant, the physical embodiment of the agency's decay. On the other side sat Loretta, hiding behind dark glasses, clutching Du's hand, looking less like a superstar and more like a woman attending a funeral. And in a way, it was a funeral. It was the funeral of a family. When Loretta took the stand, the courtroom was silent. This was the woman who sang Coal Miner's Daughter, the woman who valued loyalty above all else, now having to point a finger at the men she once loved. It was a violation of her own moral code, forced upon her by survival. Her testimony was not angry. It was heartbroken. She spoke of the early days, of the gratitude she felt. She acknowledged everything they had done for her. But then she spoke of the fear. She described the nights on the bus where Doyle's rage filled the air like toxic gas. She described the humiliation of apologizing for her manager's behavior. She described the confusion of working herself to the bone and having nothing to show for it but a recoupable expenses ledger that never seemed to go down. She wasn't just testifying about business. She was testifying about betrayal. She was telling the court and the world that the men who claimed to be her fathers were actually her captors. But the most tragic figure in the courtroom was not Loretta, nor Doyle. It was Teddy. Teddy Wilburn had to testify. He had to sit there and defend the indefensible. He was the good brother, the architect, the man Loretta had truly loved and trusted. And yet, his loyalty to his blood, to Doyle, forced him to align with the destruction. He couldn't separate himself from the entity of the Wilburn Brothers. To admit Doyle's incompetence was to admit his own failure to control the business. To admit they had failed Loretta was to admit that their empire was a sham. So Teddy fought her. He used his intellect, his detailed knowledge of the contracts, to try and trap her. He argued that they had invested thousands of dollars when she was a nobody. He argued that they had made her a star. He argued that she was ungrateful. It was a devastating betrayal for Loretta. To see Teddy, the man who had taught her how to dress, the man who had polished her songs, the man who had been her confidant, looking at her with cold, legalistic eyes, was a wound that cut deeper than any of Doyle's drunken insults. It was the moment she realized that Teddy, for all his kindness, was ultimately a businessman, and she was just an asset he was trying to liquidate. The Wilburns' legal strategy relied heavily on the concept of the contract's sanctity. It doesn't matter if we're bad managers. Their argument essentially went, she signed the paper. The paper says 20 years. The paper says exclusive representation. If she leaves, she pays. It was a cynical argument, but a legally potent one. The music industry was built on exploitative contracts. If the judge ruled that a bad relationship was grounds for terminating a contract, the entire foundation of Nashville would crumble. Every artist who hated their manager, which was most of them, would sue for freedom. The industry was watching this case with bated breath. The labels, the agencies, the publishers, they were all silently rooting for the Wilburns. They needed the contract to hold. But Loretta's team had a weapon, the forensic accounting. They began to dismantle the recoupable expenses. They showed the court the inflated costs. They showed how the Wilburns charged Loretta for expenses that benefited the agency more than the artist. They showed the circular flow of money, how Surefire Music paid Wilhelm Agency using Loretta's money. And then there was the sheer undeniable reality of Doyle's conduct. The judge, a man of the law but also a man of common sense, had to look at Doyle Wilburn and ask himself, is it reasonable to force a woman to entrust her livelihood to this man? The evidence of Doyle's alcoholism and erratic behavior was overwhelming. It wasn't just bad management, it was negligence. It was professional malpractice. You cannot enforce a contract for services if you are incapable of providing those services. The Wilburns promised to manage her career. Doyle Wilburn, by 1970, could barely manage a bar tab. The climax of the legal battle wasn't a dramatic aha moment like in a movie. It was a slow, grinding attrition. It was day after day of testimony that chipped away at the Wilburn myth. It was the public dismantling of their reputation. For the Wilburns, the lawsuit was a suicide mission. By suing Loretta, they forced her to reveal the rot inside their agency. They thought they were punishing her, but they were actually exposing themselves. Every day the trial went on, another promoter decided never to work with them again. Every headline about Doyle's drinking was a nail in the coffin of their business. They were winning the battle to look strong, but losing the war for their legacy. Loretta, meanwhile, was suffering. The stress was immense. She was physically ill, plagued by migraines and mysterious ailments brought on by the pressure. She was still touring, trying to make money to pay her legal bills, but the joy was gone. Every time she sang a song, She knew the Wilburns were calculating their percentage of it. Every time she walked on stage, she wondered if a sheriff was waiting in the wings with a subpoena. Dew was her rock during this time. The man who had been a source of so much pain in her marriage became her fiercest defender. He sat in court every day, glaring at Doyle Wilburn. He managed the finances, scrounging up cash to keep the lawyers paid. He kept the wolves at bay. The common enemy united them in a way that love never could. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, the court reached a decision. The verdict in Wilhelm Agency versus Loretta Lynn was complex, but the headline was clear. Loretta Lynn was free. The judge ruled that the Wilhelm Agency had committed a material breach of contract. Doyle Wilburn's misconduct, his failure to properly represent her, and the agency's mismanagement of her career constituted a violation of the fiduciary trust required in a manager-artist relationship. The contract was null and void. Loretta was no longer bound to the Wilburn Brothers. But it wasn't a clean break. The financial ruling was a wash, a legal term that essentially means nobody gets paid. The court acknowledged that Loretta had technically owed the agency commissions on earnings during the dispute. However, the court also acknowledged that the agency's mismanagement had caused Loretta significant financial damages, lost opportunities, damaged reputation, suppressed income. The judge did the judicial equivalent of shrugging. He owes you, you owe him. Let's call it even. Loretta didn't get a big settlement check. She didn't get back the millions of dollars in publishing royalties that Surefire Music had collected over the last decade. She didn't get an apology. What she got was her life back. She walked out of the courthouse into the bright Tennessee sun, blinking behind her dark glasses. She was poorer than she should have been. She was exhausted. She was branded a troublemaker by the establishment. But she held the deed to her own voice. For the Wilburn brothers, the verdict was a catastrophe masked as a stalemate. They told the press they were vindicated because they didn't have to pay her damages. But the industry knew the truth. They had lost their crown jewel. They had been branded by a court of law as incompetent managers. The Wilburn Brothers show was effectively dead walking. Without Loretta, and with the brothers' reputation in tatters, the network interest evaporated. Doyle took the loss badly. He retreated further into the bottle. The lawsuit had been his last stand, his attempt to prove he was still the boss, and the court had told him he was unfit to lead. His bitterness consumed him. He would spend the rest of his short life ranting about how Loretta had stolen from him, how she was an ingrate, how he had made her. Teddy took the loss with a quiet, devastating resignation. He had lost his brother to alcohol, and now he had lost Loretta to the law. The empire he had designed was crumbling. Surefire Music still owned the copyrights, a stream of income that would keep them comfortable, but the cultural relevance was gone. The phone stopped ringing. The family was broken. For Loretta, the immediate aftermath was a strange, vertigo-inducing freedom. She had spent her entire adult life being told what to do, where to go, what to sing, and what to wear by Teddy and Doyle. Now the silence was deafening. She looked at Dew. "Well," she might have said, "I guess we're on our own." But being on her own was exactly what she needed. The 1970s were waiting for her, the decade of coal miner's daughter, the autobiography, the movie, the superstardom. It was all ahead of her. And she would walk into it, not as a protege, not as a girl singer, but as the boss. The Civil War of Music Row was over. The casualties were high, but the survivor was the one with the microphone. However, the shadow of the Wilburns didn't vanish overnight. Contracts cast long shadows. The issue of the publishing rights, the songs she had written, the stories of her life that were legally owned by Surefire Music, remained a festering wound. She was free to manage herself, but every time she sang her biggest hits, the Wilburns got paid. It was a ghost tax, a reminder of the trap that never truly opens all the way. Loretta Lynn was free, but she was about to discover that in the music business, freedom is just another word for having to fight your own battles. And the next battle wasn't against a manager, it was against the past itself. She had to reclaim her history, her narrative, and her money from the ruins of the Wilburn Empire. The gavel had fallen, the verdict was read, and the legal shackles were officially broken. But in the music business, as in life, freedom is rarely a clean break. It is a jagged tear, leaving edges that remain raw and bleeding for years. For Loretta Lynn, the 1970s would be the decade of her ascension to the status of a living legend. For the Wilburn Brothers, it would be a slow, agonizing descent into obsolescence, a decade-long funeral for an empire that had once seemed invincible. The contrast between their fates was so sharp it felt like a biblical allegory. Loretta Lynn walked out of that courtroom and into the stratosphere. Unburdened by the stifling control of the Wilhelm Agency, she was finally able to fully spread her wings. She released Coal Miner's Daughter, a song that was not just a hit, but an anthem, a defining document of the American working class. She became the first woman to win the Entertainer of the Year award from the Country Music Association in 1972. She was on the cover of Newsweek. She was a guest on The Muppet Show. She was no longer just a country star. She was a cultural icon, a symbol of resilience that transcended genre and geography. But while Loretta was basking in the flashbulbs of the paparazzi, the lights were literally being turned off at the Wilburn offices on 16th Avenue. The immediate casualty of the lawsuit was the brothers' reputation. In the close-knit, gossip-fueled ecosystem of Nashville, the verdict was a scarlet letter. They were no longer the benevolent godfathers of the scene. They were the men who had tried to enslave the queen. Promoters stopped calling. New talent, warned by the whispers of industry insiders, steered clear of the Wilhelm Agency. The roster of artists, once teeming with potential stars, dwindled to a handful of loyalists and those with nowhere else to go. The most painful blow came in 1974. The Wilburn Brothers show, the syndicated television juggernaut that had run for over a decade, was canceled. For years, the show had been their primary weapon, the carrot they dangled to attract talent, and the pulpit from which they preached their gospel of traditional country music. Without Loretta Lynn as the anchor guest, the ratings had softened. Without the respect of the industry, the A-list guests stopped showing up. The network affiliates, sensing the shift in the wind, dropped the program. The cancellation was more than a business failure. It was an existential crisis. For Teddy and Doyle, the show was their identity. It was the proof that they mattered. When the cameras stopped rolling, they were just two aging men in bad suits, standing in an empty studio listening to the echo of their own fading relevance. The most insidious part of this tragedy was the ghost tax. Though Loretta was free from their management, she was not free from their ownership. Even as she stood in the spotlight as a liberated woman every time she sang her own life story on stage, she was effectively paying rent to the men she had fought to escape. This was the lingering poison in the wound. For Loretta, it was a constant, humiliating reminder of her own naivety. She had poured her soul onto paper bags and napkins, her pain, her marriage, her childhood, and she had signed those papers over to men who viewed them as annuities. It felt as though she had lost custody of her own spiritual children, her songs, forced to watch from a distance as strangers profited from their success. For the Wilburns, particularly Teddy, this publishing revenue was a golden parachute that felt like lead. It made them rich, immensely rich, but it was wealth without honor. They were surviving on the creative blood of the woman who despised them. They were landlords of a property they hadn't built, collecting rent from a tenant who had long since moved out. It was a hollow victory, a financial triumph that only underscored their artistic bankruptcy. And then there was Doyle. If the lawsuit was a blow to the business, it was a death sentence for Doyle Wilburn. He was a man whose entire sense of self was constructed around his power. He was the man who made Loretta Lynn. That was his headline. That was his pickup line in the bars. That was the shield he used to protect his fragile ego. When the court ruled that he was incompetent, when Loretta walked away and became even bigger without him, that shield was shattered. He didn't just lose a client, he lost his narrative. The world saw him not as a Svengali, but as a parasite. Doyle's decline in the 1970s was a gruesome spectacle, a slow-motion car crash that everyone in Nashville watched, but no one could stop. The alcohol, once a crutch, became the only thing holding him upright. He was rarely sober. The handsome, charismatic showman of the 1950s dissolved into a bloated, red-faced caricature. His voice, once a crucial part of the brothers' tight harmony, became ragged and unreliable. He became a ghost on Music Row. He would show up at the old office, drunk at 10 a.m., ranting to the secretaries about how he was going to find the next Loretta, about how ungrateful she was, about how he was going to sue everyone. He became litigious, paranoid, and bitter. He burned bridges with the few friends he had left. He was banned from certain bars. He was whispered about in pitying tones at the Opry. Teddy Wilburn watched this happen from the front row. This is the silent tragedy of the older brother. Teddy was trapped in his own purgatory. He was the caretaker of the ruins. He managed the publishing company, the only part of the empire that still functioned, with a grim efficiency. He signed the checks. He managed the investments. He made sure the lights stayed on in the mansion they shared with their elderly mother. But he couldn't save Doyle. He had spent his entire life trying to save Doyle, covering for his mistakes, apologizing for his outbursts, protecting him from the consequences of his actions. But now, there was nothing left to protect. The consequences had arrived. Teddy became a recluse. He retreated from the social scene of Nashville. He stopped going to the parties. He stopped looking for new talent. He became a custodian of the past, living in a house filled with gold records and silence. The bond between the brothers, once their greatest strength, had become a suicide pact. Teddy wouldn't leave Doyle, even as Doyle dragged them both down into the darkness. Meanwhile, Loretta's star continued to rise, and with it came the ultimate act of revenge, erasure. In 1976, Loretta released her autobiography, Coal Miner's Daughter. It became a massive bestseller, the first country music book to cross over into the mainstream literary world. In the book, she told her story, the poverty, the marriage to do, the rise to fame. When she wrote about the Wilburn brothers, she didn't eviscerate them with anger. She dismantled them with indifference. She acknowledged their role in discovering her, yes, but the narrative made it clear she succeeded in spite of them, not because of them. The book painted a picture of a woman finding her own voice, stepping out of the shadows of controlling men. For Doyle, reading that book or hearing about it through the fog of whiskey must have been excruciating. He wanted to be the hero of her story. Instead, he was a footnote, a stepping stone she had walked over on her way to glory. Then came the movie. In 1980, Coal Miner's Daughter hit the silver screen. It was a cultural phenomenon, winning an Oscar for Sissy Spacek. Millions of people watched the story of Loretta Lynn, and in the cinematic version of her life, the Wilburn brothers were barely characters. They were composites, background figures reduced to plot devices. The complexities of their relationship, the decade of shared history, the family dynamic, it was all compressed and sidelined to focus on Loretta and Du. This was the final indignity. The Wilburns had spent their lives trying to be stars. They had put Loretta on their TV show. Now she had a Hollywood movie, and they were left on the cutting room floor of history. They had been written out of the legend they helped create. By the early 1980s, Doyle Wilburn was a broken man. His body, punished by decades of abuse, began to fail. The man who had once charmed millions could barely walk. He was a prisoner in his own home, surrounded by the artifacts of a career that felt like it belonged to a stranger. The end came on October 16th, 1982. Doyle Wilburn died of lung cancer, complicated by the ravages of alcoholism. He was only 52 years old. It was a quiet death. There were no breaking news bulletins on the national networks. The world that was obsessed with Loretta Lynn barely noticed the passing of the man who had discovered her. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by the old guard of Nashville, the survivors of the golden era, who remembered the Wilburns when they were young and hungry. Loretta Lynn did not attend the funeral. Her absence was the final period on the sentence of their relationship. It wasn't an act of malice, it was an act of self-preservation. To go back would be to reopen the door to the cage. To stand by his grave would be to acknowledge a debt she no longer felt she owed. She sent flowers. She released a polite statement acknowledging his passing. But she stayed away. She mourned him, of course. You cannot spend a decade with someone, travel thousands of miles with them, share meals and stages and dreams with them, without loving them in some complicated, fractured way. She mourned the Doyle of 1960, the handsome man who bought her dinner and told her she was a star. She mourned the potential of what they could have been if greed and addiction hadn't poisoned the well. But she did not mourn the man who had died. That man had been dead to her for a long time. With Doyle gone, the silence descended. For the next 21 years, Teddy became the phantom of Music Row. He was a man out of time, a ghost haunting the very machine he had helped to build. While Nashville transformed around him, morphing from a dusty southern town into a slick corporate metropolis of glass towers and copyright lawyers, Teddy remained in the old world. He sat in the offices of Surefire Music, the last fortress of the Wilburn Empire, guarding the vault. He was a wealthy man, sustaining his lifestyle on the dividends of the catalog he refused to release. But wealth is a poor substitute for relevance. He sat in the silence of the Surefire offices, the landlord of a legacy that no longer spoke to him. But wealth is a poor substitute for relevance, and an even poorer substitute for family. Teddy had lost his brother, his partner, his other half. The Wilburn brothers were now just Wilburn. The harmony was broken, and the woman who had been the daughter he never had, the woman he had molded and polished, and perhaps in his own quiet, controlling way, loved, she was gone too. Loretta Lynn was living in a different stratosphere. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, she cemented her status as the matriarch of country music. She was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 1988. She was a Kennedy Center honoree. She was an icon. Yet despite the distance, despite the lawsuits, despite the decades of silence, the tether remained. It was an invisible umbilical cord made of ink and shared history. Loretta could never truly escape the Wilburns, because every time she looked at her career, she saw their fingerprints. When she walked on stage, the posture she used was the one Teddy taught her. When she structured a set list, she used the logic Teddy instilled in her. They were in her DNA as an artist. There is a profound sadness in the later years of Teddy Wilburn. Those who knew him describe a man of immense dignity and deep melancholy. He didn't speak ill of Loretta in public. He didn't give tell-all interviews trashing her. He maintained the gentleman persona to the end. He watched her from afar, seeing her triumphs on television, perhaps feeling a complicated mixture of pride and bitterness. I made that, he might have thought. And she forgot. But Loretta hadn't forgotten. She had simply survived. In interviews during these years, when asked about the Wilburns, Loretta's tone softened. The sharp edges of the legal battle had been worn down by time. She spoke of them with a kind of weary grace. I loved them, she would say. They did a lot for me. But I had to leave. I had to feed my kids. It was the statement of a woman who had made peace with her past, even if she couldn't repair it. The question that hung over Nashville for 2 decades was, would they ever reconcile? Would the Queen and the architect ever sit down face to face and bury the hatchet? The answer, tragically, is no. The silence stretched on year after year, calcifying into a wall that neither was willing to climb. The business had done its damage. The betrayal, her leaving, their suing, was too fundamental. In the code of the mountains and the code of the handshake deal, some breaches are irreparable. The end of the Wilburn era arrived on November 24th, 2003. Teddy Wilburn died of heart failure just days before his 72nd birthday. His death was the final severing of the tie. The last living link to the Wilburn Brothers show, to the bus rides, to the early days of the Nashville struggle, was gone. Loretta released a statement. It was brief, respectful, and tinged with the sadness of a closed chapter. She acknowledged his role in her life. She acknowledged that without him, she might not be who she was. But she didn't attend the funeral. Just as with Doyle, she stayed away. The door to that room was closed, and she was not going to reopen it. With Teddy gone, the empire was officially dust. The Wilburn estate eventually sold the Surefire Music catalog. The songs, Loretta's songs, passed into the hands of corporate conglomerates, just another asset in a portfolio. Loretta never regained ownership of her early publishing rights. To the end of her life, she didn't own Coal Miner's Daughter. This is the final brutal irony of the story. The Wilburns lost Loretta, but they kept her soul. They lost the relationship, but they kept the receipt. So, what are we to make of the Wilburn brothers and Loretta Lynn? How do we judge this story in the grand court of history? It is tempting to paint it in black and white, to see it as a simple morality play, the innocent victim and the evil exploiters, the naive genius and the greedy suits. But the truth, as we have seen, is far more uncomfortable. The truth is gray. Without the Wilburn brothers, there is no Loretta Lynn. This is the hard pill to swallow. Without their initial investment, without their polish, without their platform, she likely would have remained a local curiosity in Washington State or a struggling singer in the Nashville trenches. They saw her potential when no one else did. They gave her the microphone. They taught her how to use it. They were her teachers. They were her champions. They were her family. But they were also her captors. They mistook mentorship for ownership. They believed that because they watered the seed, they owned the tree and all the fruit it would ever bear. They couldn't distinguish between gratitude and servitude. They tried to freeze her in time, to keep her as the naive girl singer who needed them, refusing to accept that she had grown into a woman who didn't. Their tragedy was a tragedy of ego. They couldn't let go. If they had renegotiated in 1968, if they had treated her as a partner instead of a possession, they could have shared in her glory for decades. They could have been the revered elder statesman standing beside her at the Hall of Fame. Instead, They chose control over connection, and they lost everything. Loretta Lynn's victory was a victory of the human spirit over the corporate machine. She proved that talent, raw, undeniable, authentic talent, is the one thing that cannot be fully commodified. They could own the paper, but they couldn't own the voice. They could keep the royalties, but they couldn't keep the love of the audience. Her story is a warning shot that still echoes in Nashville today. It is a lesson taught to every young artist who steps off the bus with a guitar and a dream. Read the contract, own your masters, trust your gut, and never, ever let someone tell you that you owe them your life just because they opened a door. The music industry is a business of selling emotion. It is a business of selling lies. But Loretta Lynn, the coal miner's daughter, managed to do the impossible. She told the truth. She told the truth about her marriage. She told the truth about her life. And in the end, she told the truth about the men who made her. The final image of this story is not a courtroom nor a funeral. It is that vibrant Technicolor footage from the early 60s. There they are, Teddy and Doyle, in their sparkling suits, smiling that professional smile. And standing between them, looking small and shy, is Loretta. She is holding a guitar. She looks at them for approval. They nod. She steps to the microphone. And then she opens her mouth. And the sound that comes out is louder, stronger, and more real than anything they could ever control. The song begins. The cage opens, and the bird flies away, leaving the architects alone in the silence they created.